everybody, and thank you for joining us today on this CREST day of webinars for incident response. And our webinar now is with regards to becoming ransom aware, which is led by a team of Deloitte at Deloitte, and they are Caroline Honeycombe, Colby Clayton and Martin Heyde. So I will just be passing over to them in a second, but just before we do that, you do have an opportunity to ask them any questions that you have. And so there is a question pane. You can type into that question pane throughout the presentation, any of those burning questions that you do have. And of course, you can put them in at the end whilst we're going through the question and answer session. So please feel free to put those in. So welcome to the presentation, and I will hand over to the team. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for attending this afternoon. So first of all, my name's Martin Heyde. I'm a technical director. I lead Deloitte's cyber incident response capability. We're going to be spending the next 30 to 40 minutes to share some of the experiences that we've had with you on both responding to live ransomware incidents, as well as our experience in supporting organizations preparing for and responding to the ransomware incidents that we're going to give you some examples of. So what we're actually hoping to share with you today is practical experience, both in the heat of the incident, as well as some of the preparatory issues that we've identified that some organizations struggle with, and where we see that you can get some real value from that. So as part of the team today, I've got two of my colleagues who will also be talking to you. First of all, I'd like to introduce Caroline.
Thank you, Martin. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Caroline Honeycombe. I'm a senior manager within Deloitte's cyber incident response team. I'm also a technical incident responder and ransomware readiness lead. As part of this team, I've responded to multiple global large-scale ransomware incidents. I've led remediation projects and post-incident following ransomware incidents. Prior to Deloitte, my background includes over 10 years with the UK government in both an investigative and intelligence perspective, and also roles within the financial services sector.
And also joined by Colby.
Thanks, Martin. Good afternoon, everyone, and great to be here with you today. My name is Colby Clayton. I'm a senior consultant with Deloitte's cyber incident response team. Along with Martin and Caroline, I sit within our technical response function, so supporting organizations to investigate, contain, and recover from cyber incidents. My background is very much technical. My previous roles, I've been positioned within Deloitte's cyber attack team, which includes our penetration testing and red team capabilities. However, more recently, I've begun to play a large role in some more proactive resilience-based activities. So including readiness-based assessments and overall response capability developments.
Thank you very much, both. So to start this off, what I'm going to do first of all is give you a little bit of an introduction to how we've baselined some of the work that we've done, some of the trends that we've identified, how that's evolving, and therefore what we are seeing in terms of the required actions. So to start off with some of the trends, first of all, this has been a significant issue for a number of organizations publicly and not so publicly over the last couple of years. So I'm sure that there's a lot of you who have some practical experience in this, hopefully not on the negative side, but it's certainly been something that you will have been made aware of or considered. From the organizations that we work with, a majority, if not the majority, are taking ransomware as their #1 cyber risk at the moment. So, and that's purely because of the impact that it does have to an organization. Some of the statistics that we've got on the screens there are significant in themselves. The bottom left-hand corner, so Sophos is quoting that 28% of organizations were affected by ransomware in some form or another in the last year. And the £20 billion US dollar figure in the middle is also not insignificant. Now that's changing the way that organizations need to consider how they both detect respond to and ultimately recover from these types of incidents, because the impact is much more than just an IT or a cyber issue. It very much becomes a whole business issue. Certainly in relation to certain aspects of GDPR and other considerations such as cyber insurance, which more organisations are taking advantage of in terms of the coverage that provides for ransomware protection. However, with the significant increase and the expectation that that's only going to increase over the coming years, that will also have different impacts on organisations in terms of how they purchase and what the sort of coverage that they get from their cyber insurers. Now, on the right-hand side of the screen is some real-life MITRE attack mapping that we've seen from the incidents that we've been involved in, and you can see from that this is no longer, as it was a number of years ago, a single IT asset that is affected by ransomware. Certainly, when you get towards the lower part of that list, specifically the exfiltration, that is an increasingly worrying trend that organisations are having to face. Again, specifically related to the weaponization of GDPR. So let's just touch upon some of the evolution aspects of ransomware and their campaigns. Now, we've started the timeline here in 2013 with CryptoLocker as the example. Over time, the attacks perpetrated by the threat actors have gone from more randomized mal spam campaigns that have a lower impact, still significant impact in some cases, to the 2017 NotPetya attacks that had global impacts and started to actually affect the ability of businesses to operate and ultimately putting a number of organizations out of business. Back to where we are back in 2020 and moving into 2021, where ransomware in terms of its capability as just a piece of code has changed significantly, as well as the attacker's motivations. Now, that's both in terms of the technical capability of the ransomware itself, but also the additional capabilities that the attackers have and the tactics that they follow to actually get to their objectives, which is ultimately deploying the ransomware. Now, ransomware as a service has changed that in terms of actually it's a lot more easy for threat actors to target the most disruptive ransomware to their attack objectives. However, GDPR and the weaponization of that in terms of the double extortion is introducing new challenges to business, where it firmly has to be a business response rather than just an IT-based issue. The Maze ransomware threat actors have done it on a number of occasions, and there are other threat actors who are also operating in those areas where they're spending increasing time on target. They are breaching the organization. They're actively compromising the infrastructure. They are exfiltrating and stealing your data. So even if you do have a robust recovery capability, they can still move to a more traditional extortion mode, knowing that if you're going to stick to the GDPR guidelines, or even if you're not, they can tip them off, and therefore they can ransom you in that respect, rather than having to rely on only the ransomware to monetize their attacks. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over to Caroline to talk through some of the threats and how they actually materialize, and then give you some real world examples of issues that we've identified. Caroline.
Thanks, Martin. So as we've just heard with regards to the threat landscape, external threat is transforming at pace, and the sophistication of cyber attacks and ransomware continues to grow. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about kill chains and also some best practice. At a high level, and to help provide background for the next slide, this is just an example of a very simplified kill chain from threat actor entry through to ransomware incident. So firstly, a threat actor can and will perform reconnaissance to determine how they can attack and target a business. And then once the threat actor has identified a vulnerability or vulnerabilities, they will then attempt to gain intrusion by utilizing malware, which will exploit these vulnerabilities and weak points. The threat actor will then try to escalate privileges in order to gain higher permissions within the network or systems. And this could be through, although not limited, to identifying unsecured repository of credentials, by monitoring unencrypted network traffic to identify credentials, or through changing permissions on existing compromised accounts. Using these credentials, or by utilizing vulnerabilities which yield the same results, the threat actor will actually move through the network to find a business's most valuable assets, for example, a finance server, until the ultimate goal is reached. From here, malware will then be installed on assets, which could open up a command and control channel. And finally, the ultimate threat actor's objective can then be reached by launching a ransomware incident and therefore encrypting assets, for example, the finance server. So moving into the next slide, I'll discuss the anatomy of attacks from previous real-world experiences. And I realise this slide's quite busy, but the story that I want to tell here is that while some phases of the kill chain may vary slightly, the initial and end outcomes are always the same, as key elements of the kill chain are present. So, for example, exploitation of vulnerabilities, privilege escalation, and lateral movement. To talk through this in a bit further detail, in these particular examples here, the threat actors gained a foothold on the networks through phishing, web links, stolen credentials, and a misconfigured server that was brute forced. The threat actors introduced initial malware, had a bit of a poke around the network, and performed some reconnaissance. And then in each of these examples, the threat actors progressively escalated their privileges to allow them to complete their objective, which was to gain full control of the network in order to introduce ransomware, and in a few of these instances, steal data. So almost all ransomware attacks that we see involve an element of privilege access compromise. For example, in a Windows environment, domain admin is the keys to the kingdom. So ultimately, the story is always the same. It's just the initiation which differs. But why is the story the same? We see common controls that consistently fail. And just sort of to touch on some as examples, Active Directory vulnerabilities. I mean, this just allows an attacker to find attack paths and escalate their privileges to domain admin. Cloud vulnerabilities, for example, the brute forcing of misconfigured servers, and misconfiguration of anti-phishing controls, for example, safe links in Office 365. Therefore, addressing these misconfigurations and common controls can ultimately break the kill chain and reduce the likelihood of an extinction-level ransomware incident. Now, following this, I'm just going to touch on some cyber best practice and how to sort of achieve greater resilience. And as both Martin and I have mentioned, ransomware attacks are evolving in volume, sophistication, and impact, making it harder for organizations to effectively detect and respond to advanced threats. So I'm going to touch on best practice, what businesses are told they should do with regard to a cyber control, versus what businesses can do to strengthen defenses and overall preparedness in order to achieve greater resilience. There are a number of best practice controls which businesses should implement across preventing intrusion, so stopping that threat actor gain that foothold within the environment, and then also limiting the blast radius, so controlling controls to stop malware from spreading laterally through an environment. But fundamental to all aspects is a clearly defined and implemented strategy, which includes asset management. For example, businesses need to identify and prioritize critical business assets, and should be asking themselves, can we identify key assets and make effective risk-based decisions about them? Effective security monitoring. Businesses need to strike a balance between preventing an attack and the ability to recover from an attack when one is inevitably successful, with sort of formalized, documented, and defined incident response process. And the business's ability to respond to an incident. This must include developing, implementing, and testing plans to restore any capabilities or services that would be impaired. Businesses should, as a minimum, be implementing MFA across their estate and checking it is enabled without any misconfigurations. EDR should be deployed across both endpoint and server estate, and include legacy estate if applicable. And in order to prevent ransomware spreading through a network architecture must be configured to reduce the exposure of service with management interfaces, while enforcing the principle of least privilege of assets and personnel, and ensuring that security appliances are configured to support a zero trust initiative. Now, to achieve greater resilience, there are a number of additional controls which businesses should implement. But from our experience, this is an area that businesses do not seem to do very well and quite often fail. There are a number of these controls. However, to touch on the ones which stand out to me, these would be privileged access management and Active Directory hardening. With regard to Active Directory hardening, I mean, how often do businesses undertake a review of Active Directory to identify misconfigurations and Active Directory vulnerabilities? How often do businesses identify accounts or groups which have too high a level of privilege and control than what is actually required? And also understand who has control over which assets. Given the slide I mentioned before about how ransomware follows the same modus operandi with regard to kill chain, AD hardening and privilege access management is becoming more and more a critical control for businesses to consider in order to stop privilege escalation and lateral movement, and ultimately stop that attacker from gaining domain admin. And final control, which stands out to me for businesses to achieve greater resilience, is business continuity and data recovery planning. Backups are becoming the most effective way to recover from a ransomware attack if critical data becomes encrypted or deleted. Sophisticated attackers regularly probe networks to identify and compromise the integrity of backups prior to executing ransomware payloads. We've seen a few examples where backups have been deleted and encrypted as part of ransomware incidents. So businesses should ensure that backups are up to date and stored securely. Backup integrity is scrutinized through regular testing, and that robust technical controls and isolating measures are put in place to protect critical infrastructure from intrusion. So I'm now going to hand over to Colby to talk through how a holistic approach to ransomware resilience.
Thank you, Caroline. So we've now covered off what an attack will regularly look like, alongside some of the practices that organizations can leverage to improve their cyber posture against ransomware attacks. However, as we've identified, particularly in that last slide, these recommendations can often miss the mark, not insofar as they're incorrect or not relevant by any means, but rather that they only constitute what is in reality the bare minimum for protecting against these threats. And the challenge here is really twofold. So first of all, our experiences in supporting organizations to recover from ransomware incidents and building their overall preparedness has shown that a lot of the time these controls are looked at in isolation rather than as a collective broader defense in depth strategy. And this might be for a number of reasons, through technologies being implemented at varying stages of the organization's cyber journey, or through organizations being more reactive as opposed to proactive. Secondly, is that we've observed organizations adopting these strategies at a bare minimum, and not necessarily going that step further to achieve a greater level of resilience for each control, based on what is most applicable to the organization, their threat landscape and individual attack surface. If we look at the recommendation from the previous slide to implement EDR as an example, deploying the product to endpoints across the estate and beginning to triage alerts is really only half the battle. And organizations must be asking a number of follow-on questions, such as, has the tool been optimized to reduce false positives? Are there proper technical sub-processes in place to enable rapid triage and containments? Does the tool enable collection of telemetry across multiple mediums, and has threat intelligence been considered as part of the rollout? And really, the approach we recommend our clients to follow is one which looks at each control, which best practice recommends, as a subset of the phase of the ransomware kill chain in which it relates to. So following the graphic on screen, using delivery as an example, This encompasses all aspects of perimeter security and preventing an adversary from achieving an initial foothold in the estate. And this might include technologies and processes for web and email filtering and managing remote access, to name a few. Moving on to execution and lateral movements. These phases focus on the controls and devices which make up the organization's internal defenses, such as network segmentation, firewalls, and other network security appliances, endpoint protection and endpoint hygiene, and certainly effective patch, vulnerability, and privileged access management. What we've observed is that where organizations have adopted this rather simple approach to ransomware preparedness, and through evaluating the maturity of layered defenses at each phase of the ransomware kill chain, rather than in isolation, they've been able to achieve much greater visibility of where their gaps exist, can more easily focus their efforts based on the organization's risk appetite and tolerances and the threats most applicable to them, and gain additional assurances that tactics and techniques which make up the adversary's playbook are all accounted for. So moving on, and through supporting a number of organizations through this activity and using this approach over the last 12 months to better understand their overall preparedness against ransomware, we've been able to collect some really valuable insights which paint a nice picture as to where organizations are largely directing their efforts. For simplicity's sake, and there's a bit of context to this slide, we've gathered and averaged the collective readiness and maturity scores associated with a review of the controls at each phase of the ransomware kill chain. And looking at the visual on screen, we can immediately see a couple of patterns begin to emerge. Rather tellingly, and one which really stands out to me here, is that almost all organizations we've supported through this activity have largely directed all of their efforts at the external perimeter. Which of course is a crucial element of preventing ransomware from entering the estate. However, when we begin to look more downstream at some of the controls which make up the internal defenses, we can see that overall control maturity is largely reduced. And really what this is reflective of is organizations either knowingly or unknowingly adopting a hard shell approach. Now, the major problem in focusing all our efforts at the external perimeter and forgoing adequate internal defenses is that there really is only so much organizations can do. And even with the greatest level of maturity and most effective security technology stack pointed at that external perimeter with all the bells and whistles, we still face the ever-growing list of critical zero-day vulnerabilities, the human element through social engineering and phishing, and certainly attack vectors outside of our control, as was the case with the recent SolarWinds supply chain compromise. So indeed, an organization could spare absolutely no expense in locking down their external perimeter, and yet there are still inherent and residual risks that are so difficult to address, and which is why it is so important, and this approach really is built on one of the more prolific security principles of defense in depth. So staying with the theme of defense in depth is that we've observed fundamental weaknesses in network architecture, whether this simply be a flat or easily traversed network through foregoing segmentation altogether, or in many cases, simply not properly isolating business critical assets through additional inline controls and layered defenses. In terms of ransomware and minimizing the impact should an adversary achieve a foothold, this really is one of the more crucial anti-ransomware capabilities an organization can have in their back pocket, in making both life as difficult as possible for an adversary to achieve their objectives, but also for ransomware to propagate throughout the estate. However, this would be one of the areas that we've observed perhaps the lowest overall maturity and uptake in. And to tie off the technology elements is that we've observed an insufficient or weak implementation of identity protection schemes, such as multi-factor authentication for remote services. And this has occurred across a significant majority of organizations. But beyond that, additional compensating controls, such as whitelisting placed on remote access interfaces. Again, this is one of those crucial first line of defense for making life if we consider the MITRE attack framework presented earlier and the techniques most prominent among ransomware actors, compromising valid accounts and remote access interfaces remains one of the more prolific attack vectors. So moving on to some of the more operational weaknesses, we routinely observe gaps in an organization's broader response capability itself. In some, but not all cases, organizations did possess a defined incident response plan in some capacity. However, these plans often didn't account for incident-specific actions, such as those we would expect to see in containing and responding to ransomware events. What we've observed throughout our experiences on the front lines of ransomware incidents is that organizations who have well thought out, well-defined plans and practice the execution of these plans through mock exercises, they do avoid some of the more common pitfalls and panic-driven decision-making, which overall results in a much more quicker, much more decisive response. And staying with that for a moment, it's so important that sufficient time and effort is placed into building overall organizational readiness alongside the technical defenses. Incident response plans must go beyond the bare minimum and emphasize aspects such as clear internal and external communications processes, a response, escalation and recovery protocol with defined objectives. In particular, the organization's position and stance on ransomware ransom demands as either part of these plans or in the form of supporting material and playbooks. And unfortunately, again, a lack of depth to response planning is one of the more common themes associated with carrying out these activities. But formalizing policies and documentation really is only half the battle, and we see a lack of focus on testing and exercising these processes in ransomware-specific risk scenarios through rehearsing the collective response of technical and executive level stakeholders, so that the roles and responsibilities of those involved in the organization's response are well understood. While the approach to backups is largely mature across organizations, what we have seen is weaknesses in the testing of the integrity of backups and the validity of data, properly isolating backup infrastructure from the network, and whether recovery infrastructure meets defined objectives, and indeed whether those objectives have been defined altogether in business continuity and disaster recovery planning. And finally, just to tie this slide off, is we've commonly observed fundamental gaps in vulnerability management coverage across organizations, and in particular, the depth at which these activities are performed. Organizations often don't possess a defined vulnerability scanning schedule, and these activities are routinely performed on an ad hoc basis. And they don't go a step beyond and diversify these penetration testing and offensive security activities to complement the broader defense in-depth strategy through elements of network segmentation testing, configuration and controls audits, and in particular, activities based on achieving certain objectives related to the ransomware kill chain. But that's about it for me. So I'm going to hand back over to Martin to summarize some of the recommendations that we can look to build a much more broader anti-ransomware strategy.
Thank you, Colby, and thank you, Caroline. So I appreciate there's a lot of information that we've provided there. Some I'm sure you will you will be more than aware of it, and some hopefully may prompt some areas of thought that will help you prepare in the future. I guess the main takeaways that I think we'd like you to take away from this is that there is not a one-size-fits-all approach to any organization. What will work for one definitely will not work for another. This is very much about a business-based response capability rather than a technology-based, be that traditional IT or security teams. It has to be a business-based response because the impact is truly against the whole of the business, not just against IT assets. The areas that I think have been highlighted is that whilst organisations are very good at trying to prevent and looking at the perimeter as an example, there's been a lot of money invested into that from a lot of organisations, and whilst that's really critical, it's not the only consideration that organisations need to take. For for those of you who were able to make one of our other colleagues, Connor Rowden's talk this morning about malware delivery, the threat actors are continually innovating in how they actually get into the network and then what they do within the inside. So whilst the perimeter is very, very key, actually the areas that most organizations aren't doing as much as they potentially could are on the inside of the organization. So limiting the blast radius is a key requirement. And again, there are some quick wins that organizations can do in relation to providing them the best capability to both protect against and limit the impact of any ransomware incident. Now, whilst micro-segmentation and network segregation is important and it is a really, really useful control, however, it's not going to be useful for a lot of organizations down to the cost and the time that it can take to implement an effective segmentation strategy across the network, which largely requires re-architecture. So I think the key area from limiting the blast radius that we'd actively encourage organizations to look at is their Active Directory and hardening that. You can have relatively quick wins by understanding how easy it is for an attacker to get to domain administrator. And if you can reduce that and make it a lot harder for the attackers to do, then the potential impact of any ransomware incident within your organization is also greatly reduced. Now, moving on to the recovery. Recovery is something that I think everyone has been banging on the drums about within industry for quite some time, and that's something that we would definitely again agree that is required. However, it needs to go beyond traditional data recovery. You need to consider the services that make your business effective and what your priorities are. Now, if your finance server is the key asset that you need to bring up in a catastrophic incident, then what is that actually requiring in terms of the services that are required to provide the effective capabilities you need? Is that directly linked to a requirement to communicate with your CMDB? If so, then actually maybe some of the services that are supporting that CMDB, as well as the CMD supporting finance capabilities, need to be reprioritized in your recovery capabilities, and you need to consider how to actually back up those as capabilities and as a service rather than just the data itself. Just to sum up, it needs to be a business response. Certainly, considering the impact of any incident that it can have within your business, understand how to and effectively looking at the planning to recover as well as the protection mechanisms will stand you in the best possible stead to defend against and ultimately recover from these catastrophic incidents. Finally, I'd just like to say thank you very much for your time this afternoon. We are available now for any questions you may have. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you very much, Martin, and thank you Colby and Caroline there as well for that great presentation. Incredibly interesting, and I think it's gone through the theme of the day to why incident response is so important and to have those things in place really. So we have had some questions come in with regards, so I'll go with the first one. So have you advocated or recommended using a zero trust approach to defeat ransomware attacks? So for example, be proactive, change from implicit to zero trust.
I'll take this one unless Caroline or Colby want to jump in. So yeah, it's always a consideration. I guess a lot of organisations find it quite difficult. It's a project to implement, so therefore the planning for that generally means that it becomes a slower burn rather than something that organisations can immediately implement. But in terms of a potential control to protect against ransomware specifically, yes, it is something that we'd like organisations to consider. But again, it has to be in relation to that there can't be a one size fits all, and for a lot of organisations, it's going to be impractical to do anything outside a long-term activity.
Lovely, thank you. Caroline, Colby, did you have anything to add at all there?
No, I was it'd be pretty much echoing exactly what Martin said there.
Lovely, thank you. So moving on to the next question. It was mentioned earlier in the presentation, and you talked about the sectors of aerospace and financial services. Is there a particular area that you see more ransomware attacks in?
I'll jump in, and I'm sure Caroline will add to that. Hence why she's turned her camera on again. So I think over the last probably 12 to 24 months, it's been quite widespread in terms of organisations that have been affected. Is the first thing to say. I think the most significant impact are in industrial-based manufacturers, and I think more broadly in the technology sectors. Now, I think the industrial sectors and manufacturing, I think, have been impacted more greatly. When organisations are affected from actually being able to produce their wares, that has a very significant impact on any ability they have to conduct business. So whether they are being targeted more so than others, I think is more difficult to quantify, but certainly the impact, I think, has been felt in certain sectors more than others. Caroline, have you got anything to?
No, I would just echo that. Yeah, I would agree. It's quite widespread, but then the impact, as Martin sort of alluded to, that sort of the industrial manufacturing sectors can have can be absolutely huge. And actually, some of the ransomware incidents that have responded to in the last year and a half have been under those sectors, and yeah, it can be catastrophically damaging. But yeah, other than that, just echo what Martin said.
Lovely, thank you very much to you all. And sort of following on from that, really, with regards to the ransomware, how often do you see people pay for the ransomware, the ransomware, and then what are kind of the implications when they have sort of paid something and then kind of got you involved, really?
So we have worked with organisations that have looked to pay ransoms. It's not something that we will always encourage or in fact ever actively encourage an organisation, but we'll support them through their decision making. The reason I say that is that whilst ransomware is very much a business nowadays, and a lot of organisations had some good success in terms of paying ransoms to be able to recover their data. There's always the question of how much can you trust the bad guys that have done this in the first place. Now, those who have paid have had some success. I think it's also fair to say that it's not necessarily as straightforward as you would pay a ransom and they'll give you a key, and you insert one key and the whole network comes back up and running. Actually, the difficulties in relation to actually correlating all of the affected endpoints and recovering them can take a significant amount of time as well. So therefore, it has to be balanced against how robust are your backups, how long is it going to take you? Because if you're going to pay the ransom and it's going to take you a week to get your systems back up and running, is it just faster to recover your systems and try and secure the issues that you're aware of immediately? So we have worked with some. We've also worked with a number of other organisations who've chosen not to, for reasons of either financial or because actually they don't trust the attackers to do it. I think the one thing that's worthy of caution to any organisations that would consider paying a ransom is that with double extortion and specific threat actors out there at the moment, stealing the data of an organisation and committing the ransomware, if you pay the ransom, then yes, you may be able to get your data back. Are you ever going to get the full guarantee that data that they've exfiltrated hasn't been sold on to anyone else? They may tell you, but again, it's an element of trust that we don't think is going to be applicable to the risk appetite of a number of organisations. Now, in terms of other impacts that may need to be considered, Now, there has been a lot of talk and increasing talk over, I think, the last 6 to 12 months about whether it's ethical to even pay it, given that you don't know where certain organisations are hosted. Is the money you're paying going to be directly funding terrorism, as an example? But there's also other impacts, such as policies within the US federal government, where their policies for actually following through on organisations that are paying will differ dramatically. From conversations that we've had with the FBI, now their policy is quite extant in that they are not looking to punish anyone for paying the ransom, because they understand the business impact and they want to be involved so they can try and understand and prevent it. However, the Treasury have a much different approach and have considered to actually formally prosecute organisations where they've done that. Certainly, where they believe that attribution is to threat actors based in Iran, as an example, where there are international sanctions. So it does become a bit of a legal nightmare that needs to be carefully considered by the business as a whole, as to whether, one, it's in the risk appetite, two, you trust the attackers, and three, whether it's going to have any other knock-on effects that you're probably not considering in what is traditionally restoring IT services.
Thank you very much for that answer. So I don't know, Caroline and Colby, whether you have anything to add to that, or we'll move on to the next question.
Nothing for me. I think that was pretty well detailed there.
Yeah, certainly pretty comprehensive. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you very much. So moving on to the next question. Do you find the companies you work with that have been compromised have been undergoing any sort of security testing? So, for example, penetration testing, red team testing, or are they typically immature with their security approach?
Do you want to take this one, Caroline?
Yeah, sure. I'd say there's an element of both here, because obviously, you know, as we mentioned, sort of attackers are getting more and more advanced. So the measures and techniques that they may take are constantly evolving. Yes, we have responded to clients that I guess you would say were immature. And perhaps, you know, had quite a sort of a legacy estate and hadn't necessarily sort of, I guess, you know, had a bit of an uplift over the last few years. However, quite recently, actually, as of last year, one of the incidents I did respond to, you would probably say they weren't mature. I mean, they were mature, sorry. You know, they actually had quite a lot of technology in place and the tooling, and they but I'd say some of the reasons that they were impacted, I guess, were sort of some of the vulnerabilities that we've spoken about. So, you know, sort of vulnerability management and patching, Active Directory, all of these sort of other areas that sometimes don't necessarily get the, you know, the right level of sort of focus. Especially with Active Directory, I mean, I think pretty much every incident that we respond to now with ransomware, sort of rebuilding Active Directory and actually taking those steps to try and block those attack paths that we mentioned is now becoming part of the response. I don't know if Martin or Colby, you've got anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think that's pretty accurate. It's a case of it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think some of the attacks are very opportunistic, and therefore whatever access they can get and whatever opportunities they take, they very much do.
Lovely, thank you very much. So I think we've got time for just one more question, squeezing just before the end. So this one's with regards to cybersecurity insurance. So the person's actually asking, would you recommend organisations investing in it? I know that's probably quite difficult to say as a whole, but I think they want to know really whether it's worth them having cyber insurance.
Sure. So I'll give you Martin's opinion, I guess, rather than anything else, because I think it really does vary. First of all, I think organisations need to understand what their business disruption insurance actually covers. Each policy, or each insurer rather, differs quite dramatically, and you might find out based upon your own risk appetites that the level of coverage that you're looking for would be covered under existing business disruption insurance. I think the other consideration is to really understand what it is that you're going to need before you look at taking a cyber insurance policy out. Certainly because the pricing of them can vary dramatically, but also some insurance policies will provide you some capabilities, whereas others will not. I think it's increasingly more likely that the insurers are actively providing, say, the first 48 hours or 72 hours of any IR support during any cyber incident. But that might be to the detriment of something else that you might find useful. So I guess to address the specific topic that we've been discussing today about ransomware, it can be useful, but I guess it's also going to depend on the scale of the organisation that you're working in. Consider what the potential ransom might be, and put that side by side as one example against what the insurance policy might be. So overall, I think it's a positive move. I think, as we've seen over the last couple of years, the insurance policies are becoming more expensive because they're covering more. But you know what, the cyber arena is becoming a little bit more dangerous or risky for the cyber insurers, in that they're having to pay out more. So I think it really does need a lot of consideration before any policies are bought, to make sure that you are getting the coverage that you are hoping.
Great, thank you very much, Martin. So unfortunately, we've come to the end of our presentation today, and thank you so much to Martin, Caroline and Colby for that brilliant presentation and for answering all those questions at the end. And thank you to our attendees for asking those questions and attending this presentation today. We still have one more presentation left at the end of the day, so please feel free to come on to that, and thank you to those that have attended presentations previously. I will just pass over to your three presenters just for a last couple of words. Thank you.
Just again, thank you very much for everyone's time this afternoon. It's been great to have the opportunity to talk to you. We're always happy to answer any questions. So please do feel free to reach out on LinkedIn as an example. You can see a few people have already. Just one please do take a pragmatic approach and really get to understand what the impact of ransomware could be within your organisation.
And thank you so much to the three of you for being part of this day. It's really appreciated. So on that note, thank you and take care, and everybody have a good rest of the day. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.